Hello, good people out there in the land of social media, your Facebooks, your YouTubes, your whatever social platform you're watching this on. The big homie, T She's coming back at you with another, well, you know how I do. Just dropping whatever it is God put on my heart to give you. And today I want to talk with you a kind of a continuation of a series. If you've watched my Facebook or YouTube or whatever, any social media outlet that I put these videos on, if you followed me at any length, you know that I've done several videos that address some conceptual issues and conceptual ideas that I like to always present with regards to Christian rap, the Christian hip hop industry, and how we ought to pursue ministry. I did, obviously my media training series, which a lot of you were blessed by. Then I did one where I talked about what Christian rap could learn from Apple Computer. And today I want to do another video that's kind of a continuation of those types of philosophical explorations with regards to Christian hip hop and just what we can learn from the world of corporate finance in general. And what I'd like to talk with you about is a concept that I learned as a business student and then in my professional career. In a former life, I was a stockbroker in my degrees in finance. And obviously, what you learn in finance is you learn different ways that companies raise capital or raise funds in order to complete or to carry out their operations. And obviously, as a business, the number one goal of a business, I should say, is growth. Right? Generally speaking, every business wants to grow. You want more sales, more revenue, more profit, right? And that makes sense. It's only right that you want to expand your operations. And one of the most important and significant ways that a company raises finances is to issue shares of ownership in their company. And typically when we talk about that, we say that a company goes public when they issue shares of stock in their companies so that anyone who has the money can participate in as an owner in that particular company. And we call that going public. So a publicly traded company is one that's generally really, really large, has lots of reach, kind of really, these are typically your household brands. Obviously, we know about the Apple computers and the Microsofts, and we know about the Exxon Mobils of the world. We know about the Walmarts and the Targets, Facebook. All of these big companies, almost all of them are publicly traded. And generally speaking, the biggest companies are publicly traded. And really, it's really quite a feat to become a publicly traded company because you have to gain so much growth that the public at large takes a general interest in owning a piece of that company because they believe they can make money in that transaction. So, but there's something that I want us to learn from this. Okay, and I want to explain kind of how it works so that you get an idea of what really is being exchanged when a company goes public. Now, let's say I own Todd's, garbage disposal service, Todd's Waste Management, right? And I got garbage trucks all over the place, and I'm taking the garbage and I'm converting it into clean energy, and I'm recycling the trash, and everybody loves it, right? I do it more efficiently and better than everyone else. And so my operations are booming, and I get to a point where I say, hey, we're doing really well. I really want to buy 2,000 trucks in the next year. Well, where are you going to get the money to do that? Well, it becomes difficult if you don't just have that money in your pocket, right? And most people don't. So if my operations are attractive enough and, certain analysts and business financiers take notice and say, hey, Todd's garbage service is growing like, hotcakes, right? Like wildfire. Let's become an investor, right? So they'll get together and they say, hey, let's do an initial public offering of your company to the public. And if my company meets certain criteria, then these finance guys will figure out what my company is valued at, and then they'll offer shares. So they'll say, hey, let's offer 1 million shares of Todd's Waste Management at $30 a share. So in one fell swoop, I can raise $30 million in capital, right? That'll buy you more than a few garbage trucks, if you know what I'm saying. So that's really a really efficient and effective way to raise money, right? And so literally they offer 1 million shares. You know, they might be open, they might start trading on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ or any of these, you know, financial markets. And now I get, literally, I take in $30 million in capital to do whatever I want to do with it, right? Pretty sweet, right? And all because I did, you know, so well as a company that, you know, somebody thought my company was worth that much, right? And so they wanted to allow me to cash in on that and take in that capital. And you think, wow, that's a pretty sweet deal, right? Well, it is a pretty sweet deal. But in every transaction, you always got to think about two things. One, what are you giving up? And the other is, what are you getting, right? So when I take in that $30 million in capital, right, to do, in a technical sense, whatever I want with it, right, that's what I'm getting. But what am I giving up? You say, oh, you're giving up, you know, 1 million shares in stock. Oh, that's not, that is what I'm giving up from a technical standpoint, but what does that mean in a practical sense? What that really means is that I'm giving up control of my business, right? Literally, quite literally, I am owned by the public, right? They own me. They own my business. I'm no longer, unless I reserve, you know, 51% of the shares, I am no longer actually the controlling factor in my business decisions. I am not the person who's in control. And so this becomes a delicate situation, as you can see. You can see why a business owner, if you grew a business, you know, from its infancy up into this big behemoth, you know, it might be attractive to get a hold of that capital that you wouldn't otherwise have access to maybe right away in exchange for control of your company. That means a lot of things. That means that if the company decides that they want to take a different direction and the public doesn't approve, then quite literally they can drive the value of my company into the ground by saying, I'm going to sell, you know. I'm not a buyer in, you know, Todd's Waste Management. I'm looking for the first guy that would take these shares off my hands because I think they're going into the toilet, right? Because if I thought they were going to be worth more in the future than they are now, then I would hold on to them, right? So when I have a big sell-off, you know, now my company might go from $30 million valuation to a $20 million valuation to a $10 million valuation, all based on the perception of what other people think my business should be doing. And not only so, but I am also basically putting myself at risk for being, if I'm one of the managers or officers of the company, I could get fired. They could say, they could have a board of directors and say, hey, we need to make a change at the helm. You know, I know you're the president of the company. I know you started the company, but we don't think you're taking it in the right direction. And so we want you out. As you might recall, that's actually what happened with Steve Jobs at some point in his career. He started the company, they went public, they took in all the capital, but then at some point, the people inside thought that he was taking it in the wrong direction. They booted him out of his own company, right? So you see how this could really become a real issue. And not only that, but during those times, you know, I got to tie in Apple somehow. So I don't know how I always end up talking about Apple, but what it ended up doing was that was during that time when Steve Jobs wasn't involved. That was kind of the dark days of Apple. I mean, they really, really were on the fritz, on the fringes, I should say, of really going under as a company. And so we know now that Apple is the big player in the tech space and one of the largest companies ever. And so you see how these decisions have real consequences. Well, what does that mean to Christian hip hop? What does that mean for us? What it means simply this. When I see a lot of people and hear a lot of voices saying we ought to just aggressively be running after these big platforms and being in the mainstream, and we shouldn't be Christian rappers. We should just be rappers who are Christian. and I've heard some quite interesting arguments for that that make me kind of scratch my head. And the one thing that I acknowledge about what they're typically after, or people who advocate this position, what they typically are after is they're saying we're going to have a bigger platform. We're going to have more exposure. We're going to be, affecting the culture in a real way. For the ones that like and are okay with being Christian rappers, the criticism is, hey, you're in your little bubble and nobody knows about you, and so you're not really affecting the world anyway. That's at least some of the arguments that I hear. And on the one hand, it is true that yes, you're getting a bigger platform, but once again, you're foolish and myopic if you only consider what you're getting, right? Just like if I go take Todd's Waste Management Services and I say, oh, I'm just getting $30 million, free money. No, it's not free money. It's not free money. Those people own my business, right? And they can literally tell me if they don't like the way I'm running it, I could be fired because I'm not the boss anymore. And that's what we need to understand about going public or chasing these public or mainstream platforms as artists. Yes, we get more exposure, but you must acknowledge that we are going to lose a bit of control of our product. And what do I mean by control? Well, it's simply this. Whenever you play the game of the mainstream, right, and all the gatekeepers and all the people who are effectively the establishment, if you're saying something that they don't like, then guess what? Then they're not going to play your music, right? And if you have committed yourself to their standards and their rules, you've taken their platforms and their resources as a means to advance your purposes, then you have to understand that they didn't give you that for nothing, right? This would seem to be common sense, but I think what I don't hear very often for those who argue that we should be pursuing these larger platforms and the resources offered by the mainstream, what I don't often see is that acknowledgement that doesn't come free. It's not free, right? And this is why I always am leery of those who think that this is just the way we ought to do it, right? It's not necessarily the way we ought to do it, because you have to acknowledge that all things being equal, if we had equally large platforms maybe in our own little lanes, or I guess our own lanes, then I think you would readily acknowledge that it's better if we have total control of what we want to say and how we want to say it without any fear of the platform being snatched from beneath us. I think that's the best case scenario. I don't think anyone could really argue against that. And so that being said, the question becomes can we get that sort of reach and platform without taking the mainstream route? And I want to argue that we most certainly can, but it does take some discipline. It will take time, and I think we can't get impatient. Now, I want to point out to you that there are many, many very, very large, very successful companies that are household names that you may, or that if I said the name of the companies, I'm going to point out one in particular, that are private companies. These are companies that did not go public. They did not raise capital by selling themselves to the general public, and therefore they are not beholden in any way to the public with regards to their valuation or the operations that they carry out. And I think, for example, this is one that I found that I think is probably the one that you would know the best. It's not necessarily the largest, but it's one of the largest. I think one of the top 10 privately held companies in the world, one of the top 10 largest, I should say. And it's one of them is called SC Johnson. Now, SC Johnson is a household name. You may not know SC Johnson very well, but you know their products. Glade air fresheners, Windex, Raid. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Ziploc bags. SC Johnson is one of the biggest players, one of the biggest household names, and I guarantee you, probably one of those products I just mentioned you have in your house right now. And SC Johnson is not a publicly traded company. Well, SC Johnson has been around since 1886. Okay, and if you go to their website, it's one of the first things that they're actually very proud of that. One of the first things you'll see on their website is a family-owned company since 1886. So the question becomes, how did they get to be huge, to have virtually universal reach and notoriety without taking the public's money? Well, I think it's very simple. They had a valuable product, right, that they brought to the market, and they, with patience and diligence, they just grew it what we call organically, right? So the other way, here's the thing: when you go public, you get this large influx of capital, like this huge, like almost like this windfall of capital, right? And it's almost like a, in some cases, like a quick, a quick fix, in a sense, where you suddenly have this huge windfall of capital, and for some companies, it ends up, being a challenge to manage these new resources, and so they might make a lot of mistakes, or may be tempted to invest in these sort of fringe projects that aren't really core and essential to the business, and it makes people nervous, and it loses money. $1 billion over here in some experimental whatever that never yields any dividends. Well, when you're a private company and you're growing organically, that means you're just selling more product, and then you're reinvesting the proceeds back into the business. You tend to be a little bit more prudent and judicious when you're spending money, because it's not other people's money, it's your money, and it can feel like other people's money, I think, for some of these publicly traded companies with this large infusion of cash. And so companies like SC Johnson, and many, many, many others. There are many others. Dell Computer is a privately held company, although they were public for a bit. And I won't go into all of that. But there are many brands that have billions and billions of dollars of annual revenue who have never taken the public's investment dollars. And so, once again, I want to reemphasize that you have to acknowledge that all things being equal, right? If you can have the choice of having lots of capital of your own, where you're not beholden to anyone, or having someone else's capital and then having them look at you like, okay, now you have my money, now you better do what I like, I think you would acknowledge that it's the former is better than the latter. And what I think CHH should really take note of is that we were growing at a great and significant organic rate. And an artist like Lecrae was a good example of that, because Lecrae had these monstrous album sales, relative to our genre. We didn't have Michael Jackson album sales or Taylor Swift album sales, but certainly topping the charts. And I guarantee you, nearly all of that, the vast majority of those album sales came from the church, right? And it just shows that when we do something well and we do something excellent, we can grow it. And I think that if we would have continued in the way that we were going, we would have had more of those artists, and then other outsiders, in a sense, would have had to take notice of us, and we would have had that platform and had those notoriety, maybe not as quickly, but I think eventually it would have grown organically, where we'd have had the reach and the platforms and the control. And I think that we would do well to at least acknowledge that if we're seeking these public platforms, that we are relinquishing control of our product in some respect. What are your thoughts, friends? I would love to hear that. You can comment, you can share. I hope I didn't ramble too much, but I think that this is an important issue that we must continue to address, even though the debate is not as persistent as it has been. I think it still needs to be discussed in Christian hip-hop circles. So once again, friends, I would love to hear your comments, and share this video if it blessed you. like it. And till next time, friends, I hope you are blessed.